necessarily experience pain. A classic example of this is a guy named HM, or he was called Hippocampal Man, was his nickname. He was a gentleman that sustained some brain surgery, brain injury. I can't remember exactly how, but he ended up having his hippocampus and his amygdala removed or severed, which created an interesting scenario for science to do a lot of research on him. And what they found is that they could elicit tissue damage in this gentleman, and he would have withdrawal responses, or he would move away from it. However, he wouldn't experience any pain at all. So this tells us that there's a certain level of brain involvement through the amygdala and the hippocampus that's absolutely necessary for the experience of pain. And if you remember, hippocampus and amygdala, that has a lot to do with your emotional capacity. So if we remove that, we don't experience the conscious experience of pain. So you can have these subconscious reflexive withdrawals and alterations in body movement and that sort of stuff based on nociception, but not necessarily experience pain. So if we cycle all the way back around to look at what's going on here, if we take that person that's stressed out, or that hasn't been sleeping well, or that's been physically overworking, or that is in a state of chronic inflammation, which is kind of some of the newer theories or proposals of why we have so much of a chronic pain issue right now. One of the reasons we have such a chronic pain issue, and we have all the metabolic syndrome and generally unhealthy people in the United States right now. If we have a chronic level of low-grade inflammation, we could possibly have an alteration in the sensitivity of the voltage-gated ion channels. And if we are stressed out, if we're not sleeping well, that can also cause neuroendocrine changes that sensitize the system as well. So at certain levels of the voltage-gated ion channels, we get an increased sensitivity in those, so they propagate more nociception up to the DRG and up the spinal cord to the brain. In the spinal cord, if we have enough repeated nociception over time going into an area, the interneuron that actually gates out the ascension of that nociception to the brain can become disinhibited, or it can become altered in the way that it functions. If we look at the microglia in the spinal cord, it can actually permanently change based on some rat studies to no longer inhibit the amount of nociception going up to the brain. And in fact, they can facilitate the amount of nociception going up to the brain. So we'll say in a normal healthy individual, me poking on your bicep muscle elicits 10 units of nociception. Well, in a stressed out, sleep deprived, over physically or cognitively worked individual, me pressing on the bicep with the same amount of force could actually elicit 20 or 50 units, we'll say units, action potentials of nociception. And then when those 20 or 50 units hit the dorsal root ganglion, they can actually not be inhibited like they maybe usually are. They could actually be facilitated into 100 or 200 or 500 units of nociception that then gets to the brain. So by the time my little bit of pressure has gotten to the brain, what would originally be perceived as 10 units of nociception is now being perceived as 500 units of nociception. And the brain's going to respond differently to a greater degree of action potentials coming from the periphery, which increases the likelihood of experiencing pain. So then the brain says, oh shit guys, fires the missiles, make everything so sensitive so we can protect it. If you guys remember the End of the World video from back like 15 years ago, that's a little play on words there. So then the brain can decide that it needs to reorganize itself and become more hypervigilant to a certain area of the body, pay more attention to it. It can develop increased processing of that nociception as well, and the whole idea of the pain neuromatrix or a pain neurotag becoming more heavily wired into the brain through neuroplasticity, we can have cortical reorganization, and we've actually have studies to show that people with chronic pain and chronic hypersensitivity have a change in their gray matter and their white matter in their brain, which we think facilitates the processing of all the nociceptive information that's coming into the body and improves the efficiency of the output of the experience of pain. So we take this really simple little soft tissue sore spot of unknown origin, and we can layer on an immense amount of complexity that looks at a change in the peripheral nociceptive system, so it's propagating more information up to the brain with the same level of tissue pressure, and then we can look at the changes in the dorsal root ganglion in the spinal cord that propagates even more information up to the brain, and then we can look at the changes to the brain that happen in chronically inflammatory conditions or chronically stressed people or people that are anxious or they're depressed or whatever it may be, and we can see that there can be absolutely nothing wrong. There can be no little muscle knot. There can be no little microspasm, and we can get a dramatic increase or alteration in the propagation of nociception to the brain, and we can get an increased response from the brain to that nociception. So kind of working through some of the neurobiology, and this is it's actually way more complicated than this, and it's more complicated than I want to put in this video or than I even understand or anybody understands. We can see that a simple single factor reductionist view of a soft tissue muscle spasm is probably selling this issue a little bit short, and alterations in pain pressure threshold are probably not just due to myofascial trigger points, but they're probably due to a system-wide alteration in the propagation of nociception to the brain and the response of the brain to that incoming information, or the sensitization and reorganization of the brain to respond to even non-nociceptive information or minimally nociceptive information. What's interesting, there's a couple of studies that show that if you anesthetize a local myofascial trigger point or highly sensitized area, you actually get an improvement in the pain pressure threshold at distal sites in the body. So if we essentially look at the nervous system as a cup that's filling up, and when that cup overflows, you get to the experience of pain. If you essentially numb a hypersensitive area that may be propagating an increased amount of nociception to the brain, that's putting less water into the cup, and all of a sudden the brain is less likely to overflow from information everywhere else in the body. So we can see that it's a lot more complicated than an isolated soft tissue sore spot, and it probably has a lot to do with a lot of neurophysiology and a lot of reorganization of the nervous system and how it functions. So that's why I want to make the argument that simply treating it with a lot of aggressive pressure or a lot of aggressive dry needling or Botox injections or tons and tons of lidocaine injections or whatever it may be, or instrument-assisted soft tissue work, while sometimes that could possibly relieve somebody's pain in the short term, it doesn't necessarily mean it's working via the mechanisms that we've been taught before. And we should probably watch our language a little bit when we so quickly label these soft tissue sore spots as myofascial trigger points or hyperactive microscopic muscle spasms, because that may be selling the problem a little bit short or oversimplifying it, which some people argue could lead to kind of nocivic thoughts from patients and fear avoidance behavior and maladaptive beliefs that subsequently lead to iatrogenic effects that maybe decreases their quality of life or causes them to seek an excessive amount of treatment that is unnecessary, which can lead down a rabbit hole of over-treatment and mismanagement. So I just wanted to throw this out here and kind of talk through some more complexity related to these soft tissue sore spots of unknown origin and see what you guys had to think about that. And hopefully it's a little bit of a thought-stimulating video for your Friday afternoon. So if you guys have a good weekend, we'll catch you next week. Later.